Everyone doesn't have their mute on.
Yep, there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Doug. And thank you all for letting me speak to you tonight. I'm really excited about it. A few things off script that I didn't prepare, but first, I'm not actually from Hamilton. I live in Hamilton now, and I'm a member of the Hamilton branch, but I was actually born at Toronto East General. So this is kind of coming home. My family moved to the West End when I was about 5, and I've since moved on to Hamilton. But I really want to thank Doug for the invitation, because I thought I knew a lot about my ancestor, and it was a couple of months ago that Doug invited me, and in getting ready for this presentation, I've learned a lot more, and I've kind of put it into I hope it'll be a coherent and organized story. And I've double checked all of my sources, and I found that a few things that I knew weren't really so. So that it's been a very good experience getting ready for this, and I hope you enjoy it as much as I enjoyed preparing it. So I'm going to tell you the story of my Loyalist ancestor, Colonel Samuel Wells. He ran an underground courier network, so he was essentially a spy. In the final years of the American Revolutionary War, provided a vital communication link between the British in Canada and the British in New York City. So basically, the messages that were going back between Governor Haldimand in Canada and Lord Dorchester in New York, it was my Canadian courier would bring them as far as southern Vermont, and it was my ancestor that got them down to the coast so that it could be carried on to New York. Since I began researching his life about half a dozen years ago, I've become more and more intrigued with this man. I've even become a little obsessed with the history of Vermont, because it is surprising and not what you really expect in some ways. And because Vermont was the way it was during the war, the experience of being a Loyalist in Vermont was quite different in many ways from being a Loyalist anywhere else in the former colonies. So I'm going to start with 2 questions for you, and I'll let you know the first one's a trick question. My ancestor died 3 years after the war. He never did, unlike most Loyalists, he never did settle. He didn't live long enough to settle in Canada, but he didn't live in the United States either. So how is this possible that my Loyalist ancestor didn't live in Canada or the United States? Does anybody know?
He died on a ship.
Went back to Vermont. He lived in Vermont.
Yeah,
Vermont was not part of the United States.
but pretend state of Vermont.
Well,
But
the de facto state of Vermont declared its independence in 1777 on January 15th, and it would remain independent, although it was never recognized by any of the other states, it was or any country, but it was in a practical sense independent until March the 4th, 1791, when it was admitted to the Union as the 14th state. From 1777 until the end of the war, 6 years later, Vermont's independence was often a great frustration for the Continental Congress and for the Commander-in-Chief, George Washington. Though it was still an ally of the United States, its support wavered from time to time. At some points, its conflicts with its neighboring states seemed to outweigh its quarrel with the British. And that's why Samuel's experience was unlike that of a Loyalist anywhere else. My second question is this, and I bet you got it. What can anyone tell me about the Haldimand negotiations? Has anyone heard of those? Was also referred to, or has been referred to, as the Haldimand Affair or the Vermont negotiations. Okay. These negotiations took place from 1780 until the end of the war in 1783. On one side, and I guess it's time to go to the next slide. On one side of the table, although he was never there in person, but his representative, was Sir Frederick Haldimand, Governor General of the province of Quebec. On the other side was a group of Vermonters headed by Ethan Allen, and his brother Ira Allen. Ethan Allen had earned fame a few years earlier in the first months of the war when he led the capture of Fort Ticonderoga. He and the Green Mountain Boys, which is the group they led, and that was essentially the first real victory that the Americans had in the war. What the Allens and Governor Haldeman were negotiating now, 5 years after the beginning of the war, was the possible reunification of Vermont into the empire. Yeah. It would have been a province with a status similar to that of Quebec or Nova Scotia. And if it had been successful, Canada would have 11 provinces, and you would not need a passport to go skiing in Vermont. My ancestor played a clandestine role in all of this. It was a role that was ultimately exposed by the Continental Forces. It was a role for which he narrowly escaped arrest and probable hanging. And one of the most satisfying moments I experienced in my family history research was when I discovered in the US National Archives a letter from Alexander Hamilton to George Washington about my ancestry. And there we go. It's dated March 5th, 1783, so 241 years ago yesterday. Alexander wrote this letter. I think it took 6 days to get there because Washington took action on the 11th. It expresses in the elegant language of the day the urgency of capturing the dangerous Samuel Wells and his colleague Luke Knowlton. Here are Hamilton's words. The bearer, and it was a man named Shattuck, the bearer Shattuck thinks he can point out the means of apprehending Wells and Knowlton, the two persons whom your excellency was authorized to have taken into custody. I have desired him to call upon you to discuss the plan. I will not trouble your excellency with any observation on the importance of getting hold of those persons. The surmise that Mr. Arnold, and it's not Benedict Arnold, it was a Congressman Arnold, that Mr. Arnold, a member of Congress, gave intelligence to them of the design to take them. It makes it peculiarly important that they be arrested. And in fact, Hamilton's surmise was correct. Samuel had been warned that his cover was blown and that his arrest was imminent. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Before I tell you what he did for king and empire, I should tell you a little bit about who he was and why I think he got away with it in the end. So we got the map up. Good, excellent. Samuel Wells, my fifth great grandfather, was born in 1730. He was actually born in Massachusetts, in Deerfield, Massachusetts. His father was Jonathan Wells, and his mother was born Mary Hoyt. Both his father, who was a trader, and his grandfather, who was also named Jonathan, were among Deerfield's leading citizens. His father, who died when Samuel was about 5, had been a selectman, or what we would call a town councillor, and he was an ensign in the militia. And his grandfather was the town's first justice of the peace. He was a selectman for 13 years, and he was later military commander in the area with the rank of captain. And one of the things I learned in preparing for this just last week, and I was rather dismayed, but one thing we do know about Samuel's family was that they were slaveholders. His mother Mary and his grandfather Jonathan Sr. were both slaveholders. So my 6th great grandmother had an enslaved man whose name was Caesar. And my 7th great grandfather had at least 2. And it's some comfort, at least, that we know their names. So their names were Adam and Pompey. And this was in Massachusetts. So we're not talking about a southern plantation. It seems that they were house symbols. So we know, based on his later accomplishments, that Samuel must have been an educated man, but we really don't know anything else about his youth. As a young man, he kept a tavern in Deerfield, and Deerfield is where he married Hannah Sheldon, my 5th great grandmother, in 1751, and they were both 20 years old when they were 11 years later, so he'd be 31, I guess, Samuel sold the tavern, and he and Hannah, with their 6 young children, uh, moved about 25 miles north. I put the pins in the map so you can see it's going from Massachusetts to what is now Vermont was, was a day's journey, I guess. Because it's at the very top. At the top of the map is Farnham, Quebec, which is where his family would ultimately settle as loyalists. Yeah, so that's where his children. He died in 1786, as I said. So he never got to Canada, but his children and his grandchildren essentially all did come. And it wasn't called Vermont at the time. It was called the New Hampshire Grants. It was part of, well, it was disputed. And much of what happens in this history is about that dispute. New Hampshire had a claim on it. And starting in 1749, the governor of New Hampshire started granting land to settlers. But New York disputed that. And it was the ruling, the Crown resolved the dispute in 1764, and the ruling was that it did not belong to New Hampshire, it belonged to New York. But that only aggravated the problem, or I should, aggravated is the right word, it made it worse. Because then the governor of New York started issuing grants, and he would grant the same land to people that New Hampshire had already granted to other people. So that's the dispute that really shaped all of Vermont's history, and is probably why it became independent. So the resulting conflict, which sometimes turned deadly, and actually some of my relatives were involved in 1775 2 people were killed. It's not really directly in the story, but yes, this conflict was so real because it was people's livelihoods that it shaped the history. It was part of the decision to declare independence, and even during the revolution itself, it was still part of what was driving Vermont's leaders. So when he first arrived in the southeastern corner of the New Hampshire grants in 1762, Samuel built a log cabin. He had a 600-acre parcel of land right on the west bank of this is the Connecticut River, and that's the border between New Hampshire and what is now Vermont. So it would have been the border between New York and New Hampshire after 1764. And this is his land, and this is his land. And I believe that much of this land was originally his and was then sold off. This is where the town of Brattleboro is now. So as the village grew, he sold off the edges of his farm to form the village of Brattleboro. He built a sawmill, operated for a number of years, built this impressive home, which I just learned the other day was lost to fire in 1922. And he would father 6 more children and generally cement his position as Brattleboro's leading citizen. A history of Brattleboro that was written in the 1920s by a historian named Mary Cabot says this, and I'll quote it. Samuel Wells was an active and consistent Tory throughout his life, and the chief military man in the southern part of the county. It was Cumberland County is the historic county that was part. It's now Windsor County, but it was Cumberland. She says, the persecution which befell other men of his allegiance, which is to say other loyalists, was meted out to him in scant measure because of his recognized superiority of character and remarkable tact. And that echoes another earlier historian, Benjamin Hall, who'd written in his 1858 History of Eastern Vermont about Samuel's social superiority. And what Hall says, quoting again, the condition of Colonel Wells was superior to that of most of the early settlers of Vermont, and the influence of his character and position was for many years extensively acknowledged. Samuel and Hannah would have 13 children in all, They lost two in infancy, a boy before they left Deerfield, and then a girl shortly after arriving in Brattleboro. And we actually have an idea of what he looked like. There aren't any surviving portraits that I know of, but Ms. Cabot described him as, quote, a large man, above medium height, stern in bearing and countenance, but affable in manner. His dress was in the style of the landed gentry of the period, half military, half yeoman. And another source suggests that he was actually more than just a large man. It quotes a letter from one of Samuel's contemporaries, who in a kind of semi-veiled way calls him a corpulent person. It's kind of roundabout, but he tells an unflattering anecdote about how Samuel, they were in a meeting talking about repairing some of the mountain roads. And apparently on the road they were talking about, Samuel had fallen off his horse, slipped in the mud on the muddy mountain road, and hampered by his bulk, struggled and slipped trying to get back on his horse. So he was a very big man. In 1766, he was appointed a judge and a justice of the peace. In 1773, he was elected to the General Assembly of New York, the province of New York, of course, at the time. And by early 1775, according to one source, he was counted among the principal officers in the courts of the county. And then the war came. And we only have a handful of glimpses of Samuel and his family during the early years of the war. But every one of them supports what Ms. Cabot had said, that he was a dedicated Tory all through his life. He was a Loyalist throughout his life. He never wavered from his principle. He suffered for them, but he was respected enough, savvy enough, and influential enough that he was able to weather the storm. In September 1775, the Committee of Safety for Cumberland County questioned him on suspicion of bringing arms into the county on behalf of the Crown, but no charges were laid. In February 1776, Samuel's son-in-law, Samuel Gale, who was married to his daughter, Rebecca, was arrested and imprisoned and spent quite a few months in prison. A few months later, Samuel himself was arrested, but he was promptly released. And in fact, the Committee of Safety reprimanded the arresting officer, and I quote, for his conduct in taking Colonel Wells by military force, that mode of proceeding being contrary to the minds of this committee. But things did get worse the following year, and I'll quote again from the History of Eastern Vermont by Benjamin Paul. In the New York Gazette, under date of June 23rd, 1777, it is stated that Judge Wells of Brattleboro had been lately confined to his farm and otherwise ill-treated. That's the end of the quote from the Gazette. And then the historian goes on to say, and it is known that for a long time permission was granted to anyone to shoot him should he be found beyond the bounds of his farm. So he was under house arrest. Vermont had declared its independence by that point, but it was still, for the time being, very solidly aligned with the United States. In February 1779, the Vermont General Assembly passed a law that mentions by name Samuel's son, Oliver Wells, who is my fourth great grandfather. That's the line that I said. And he was essentially banished from Vermont. The law was entitled, and it's kind of a lengthy title, an act to prevent the return to this state of certain persons therein named and others who have left this state or either of the United States and joined the enemies thereof, and it lists 99 men and 1 woman who by leaving had manifested, quote, an inimical disposition to said states and a design to aid and abet the enemies thereof. And the punishment that my fourth great grandfather would have suffered had he come back to Vermont was quite severe. Quoting the exact words of the law, it said he would be whipped on the naked back, not more than 40 or less than 20 stripes, and ordered to quit this state immediately. And if he persisted in staying, he would be put to death. Fortunately for him, the law was repealed about a year later. It was November 1780. And by November 1780, things had really started to change in Vermont. And then something truly remarkable happened. And this, I don't actually have it in my script, but it just knocks me out how crazy this is. On March 27th, 1781, Samuel Wells was elected to the General Assembly of Vermont. Now, does that seem strange to you? It's in 1777, just a few years earlier, 4 years earlier, he was under house arrest, facing the death penalty if he left his farm. Only a year earlier, in 1780, his son would have been flogged if he showed his face in Vermont. And now Samuel is a member of Vermont's Supreme Legislative Body. And it's clear from all my sources that it was no secret that he was a Loyalist. Elsewhere, Loyalists were being persecuted, tarred, feathered, hanged, their possessions and land being taken away. And in Vermont, he's elected to the legislature. Can you imagine that happening in George Washington's Virginia or John Adams' Massachusetts? He hadn't changed over the years, but it certainly seemed by that point, Vermont's commitment to the war had changed. In fact, for more than a year at that point, Vermont's leadership had toyed openly, if perhaps not totally seriously at the beginning, with the idea of abandoning the revolutionary cause. They were frustrated with Congress's unpromising position on Vermont statehood. They had basically applied to be a state of the Union, and Vermont said, and because of New York, he rejected, but Congress said no, and land claims from the neighboring states. And that's where the Haldeman negotiations come into play. Now, I'm not an historian, but I'll try to sum up the negotiations in a couple of paragraphs. In March 1780, on behalf of Governor Haldeman, a Loyalist named Beverly Robinson wrote a letter to Ethan Allen offering the possibility that Vermont could, and I'll quote, obtain a separate government under the King and Constitution of England. Now, it took 4 months for the letter to arrive at Ethan Allen's hands. So that was July 1780. That same month, July 1780, Thomas Chittenden, who was then the governor of Vermont, wrote to Congress stating the position that Vermont was free unilaterally, and I'll quote now from his letter, to offer or accept terms of cessation of hostilities with Great Britain. And no doubt he had Robinson's letter in hand and in mind. Discussions continued until the final months of the war. And of course, you already know how they turned out. Vermont is not a province of Canada. But hostilities between Vermont and Great Britain essentially stopped at the time that the offer was made by Haldeman. So Vermont didn't achieve the separate government that Haldeman offered, but they achieved a 3-year ceasefire. The last 3 years of the war, Vermont was basically out of the war. So let's get back to Samuel, because this is where he gets involved. On May 8th, 1781, someone in British occupied New York wrote to Governor Haldeman about Samuel Wells. And some historian think that it was Beverly Robinson, same man that had written the letter to Ethan Allen. Whoever he was, this is what the letter said. Colonel Wells of Brattleboro has sent his son-in-law with verbal information that throws great light upon the conduct of Vermont. We take him to be a friend, and he says by this messenger, by his son-in-law, that you know him to be so. Is it true? He offers his services for a monthly interchange of letters between Canada and the coast of Connecticut, where we are to find a friend to give and receive dispatches. Do you approve of this confidence? Well, it was true. He was a friend, and Haldeman did approve of the confidence. Samuel Wells, in effect, became part of His Majesty's Secret Service. He organized an underground network of couriers who traveled through enemy territory to facilitate communication between Quebec, the cities of Quebec and New York. And we don't have the map up anymore, but the southern end of Vermont is almost equidistant between Montreal and the coast. So it was perfectly positioned to do this. And that's how he served his king during the Revolutionary War. It worked for about a year and a half until the fall of 1782, when it all came tumbling down. One of his couriers, a man named Christopher Osgood, was arrested and tried, and his testimony implicated Samuel Wells and an associate. And the incriminating information was sent to Congress. Congress then passed a resolution on November 27, 1782, directing George Washington, quote, to take immediate measures for apprehending and securing Luke Knowlton of Newfane and Samuel Wells of Brattleboro, and such others as there may be good reason to apprehend, have been concerned with the said Knowlton and Wells in the dangerous correspondence and intercourse with the enemy. So that was the final week of November 1782, and the letter from Alexander Hamilton that I read earlier was dated the first week of March 1783. So it means that Samuel was still at large and still a high priority 3 months after Congress had ordered his arrest, and in fact they never did catch him. And it's kind of, I'm proud of my ancestors, but the idea, it wasn't just any arrest warrant. It was Congress ordering George Washington to arrest him. So that was pretty cool. Now I'm going to tell you the story of his escape, and it sounds too good to be true. If I didn't have pretty good proof, I would be tempted to leave it out. And I think this is almost where we're going to need the other map. There we are. Okay. The reason I'm not leaving it out is that it actually has been memorialized in writing by a prominent historical figure who was involved in the escape, and that was Ira Allen. So the account of his escape is from the Political and Natural History of Vermont, or something like that, by Ira Allen. He wrote up a history of Vermont in 1798. And I'm going to paraphrase it and update the language and add a little bit of context. But so it's January 1783, and Samuel gets word, because of this guy in Congress, that there's a captain of the Continental Army with a company of soldiers that are on their way from Albany to Brattleboro to arrest him. He leaves his house in the dead of winter, intending to take refuge in Canada. He heads northwest and makes it as far as Bromley, Vermont, 40 miles away, where he puts up for the night at the home of William Utley and his wife, Sarah. And on the map, the red lines are Samuel's route and the blue lines are his pursuers' route. And this is where the plausibility just goes out the window. Who shows up at the same house, the same night, but the soldiers? The captain of the Continental Army with his company show up at the same house. Of course, he doesn't know what Samuel looks like. Nobody tells him who this corpulent person is. And the two of them end up sleeping under the same roof that night. The next morning, the soldiers get up, they march off to Brattleboro, none the wiser. And once they're gone, Samuel takes off through the snow and goes not towards Canada, but a little sort of southwest to Sunderland, Vermont, and he meets with Ethan and Ira Allen. And that's another example of how crazy it is that you've got, a loyalist plot is exposed, and the fugitive, where does he go? He goes to see two of the top leaders of Vermont, which is still at war with Great Britain. And these are two men that historians will later call the co-founders of Vermont, and yet they're consorting with this loyalist. So anyway, the illustrious brothers tell him not to go to Canada. They say he'd be better off to head for New York. They arrange a sleigh, and at midnight that night, Samuel clambers aboard the sleigh and sets out for New York City, where he arrives safely a few days later. I'd like to believe the story, and Ira Allen was there, so he should know. But the only thing that when you look at the map, if they were going from Albany to Brattleboro, why did they go to Bromley? It's way out of their way. Now, the one possibility is it's very mountainous country. And it could be that there wasn't yet a road from, say, Albany to Bennington and Bennington to Brattleboro. But I have to guess there probably was. So I need to do more research, but I'd like to verify if there was an easier way for the soldiers to get to Brattleboro. But something similar to this happened. So I'll leave it there. It's a good story. I thought it was worth writing down, but I will probably never know how much that's true. So that's all we know about Samuel's work during the war. He would return to Brattleboro once it was safe, and he would die there on August 6th, 1786, at the age of 55. Once one of the richest men in Brattleboro, he died bankrupt, having given all for his Loyalist belief. His estate was valued at £1,577, 6 shillings, 2pence halfpenny, and his debts amounted to £5,880, 2 shillings, 7pence halfpenny. I read just in the last couple of days, someone calculated that's the equivalent of being about $100,000 in debt today, 100,000 American dollars. And now all that's left is to tell you how Samuel's children and grandchildren came to Canada. It was largely the work of this man, Samuel Gale, and he's the son-in-law I mentioned as having been in prison in 1776. He was a surveyor and a former paymaster in the British Army. He moved to Quebec City in 1791, where he was named principal assistant to the Surveyor General. He was later private secretary to Governor General Robert Prescott. In his spare time, Gale worked assiduously at lobbying the authorities to grant the Wells family land in the Eastern Townships. And there's a microfilm reel in the National Archives containing transcriptions of more than 4 years of correspondence between him and whatever senior official would listen to. And perhaps the most important is this letter. It's dated October 4, 1794, and it's addressed to Guy Carleton, Lord Dorchester, who was governor-in-chief of Lower Canada. And of course, it was fortuitous that a dozen years earlier, it was Lord Dorchester who had commanded the British forces in New York City during the war. So he was the guy getting the message that Samuel sent. So he knew firsthand what Samuel had done during the war. The letter starts by reminding Dorchester of the late Colonel Wells, whose sufferings and services during the late war in America were well known to your lordship at New York. And then after a little more preamble, it goes on to say, your petitioner humbly prays that your lordship will be favorably pleased to grant to him and to the surviving parts of the family of the said late Colonel Wells, the undermentioned quantities of land in the tract order to be laid out by the name of the township of Farnham on the river Yamaska, or such parts thereof as may in your lordship's wisdom appear meet. The request was approved in principle in 1795. There were a lot of complications. You had to take an oath, but nobody was appointed as takers of oaths. So it was 1798 before the land had been surveyed, the oaths had been taken, the paperwork had been completed, and Samuel's children and grandchildren were able to travel in north. And before I wrap up, we just go back to the letter. The total he was asking for was 13,900 acres. And he tried to pull a fast one because he lists one of the children had died. So one of the grants is to his son, so to a grandson. And then he lists all both the sons and daughters, and they should each get 1,200. He says, to your petitioner, which is him, Samuel Gale, and then lists all the daughters, and one of them is his wife. So everybody's getting 1,200, but he's going to get 2,400 because he's going to get 1,200 and his wife's going to get. He didn't get away with it. They ended up getting 12,000. And that's how the Wells family, the Loyalist branch of my family tree, came to Kent. We've got time for questions, don't we?
Go ahead. I guess a comment, there was a time that, New York militias were gonna go in, like, almost like go in and conquer Vermont.
Mhm.
When we went down there, met the, Vermont militia run by the Allen brothers.
Yeah.
Plus, Haldeman said, British troops down there, when they saw these guys, they gave up. Because they're not gonna beat these guys. There's too many of them. So we got
Too many
down,
Vermonters?
there was too many Vermonters and British troops
Yeah.
standing there,
Yeah.
compared to what they did, so they gave up. But still, until 1791, they still claimed that that was their land, and they refused until Congress had to go after New York to say, we want you to give up your right to that hunk of land.
And Vermont, and it was too much to include in the talk, but since you brought it up, there was somehow they captured a quote that Samuel had, he was a judge and a lot of his friends were judges. And somebody wrote down what he had said to one of his colleagues towards the end of the war. And he said, if they said, do you think Vermont can remain a state? And he said, yes, because it's a state created by the king. And if necessary, if they come for us, we'll be able to bring 10,000 to 15,000 men out of Canada. So he felt, and he was pretty close to Ira and Ethan Allen. He felt that the British would be ready to defend Vermont from the Americans if the Americans were of course. But the question of would they maybe be part of the empire again? It didn't die with the end of the war. They used it as a bargaining chip, trying to get statehood. So they were still talking about it in like 1786, I think. If you don't grant a statehood on these terms, we'll go to the British.
There is a question in the chat from Alan. He says, I also have small L Loyalist ancestors who spent some time post-conflict in Vermont. I've had trouble getting more info on them. Any suggestions as to other sources?
Well, there's a number of books that were written in the 19th century about the annals of Brattleboro, the history of Eastern Vermont, things like that. So if they are loyalists, there's a chance they could be mentioned in some books like.
Okay.
What?
The other suggestion I have is the Happy Trust, HEPHITRUST, Happy Trust.
Can you repeat the question, Judge? Yeah.
Joanne, we don't hear you.
Okay, the other resource I can suggest for some of the material Paul is referring to is called the Happy or Happy Trust, HATHI Trust, TRUST. The other resource would be on Google Books. They're starting to bring up some of the older volumes. If that helps, Alan.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I just
Or
typed those two things in the chat.
Yeah.
or if Alan wants to put his email in the chat, I could send him a note. And elaborate a little bit.
Sure.
Oops, I didn't say that.
I would like to make a wonderful presentation. I used to be a long haul truck driver and I would very often be in Brattleboro picking up from the sawmills and bringing the lumber back to Canada. And I know the roads very well from Brattleboro to Albany. And there's no straight line. And even now, you're almost up to Bennington before you're back south towards Albany.
So it may be.
That was the only way to get around the mountain.
Okay.
Well, I'll incorporate that.
Yeah, and most of the time I avoided going that way. I went up to Rose Point and crossed across the top because it was just easier with a fully loaded truck. But yeah, trying to get over the mountains between Brattleboro and Albany was a trip and a half in a fully loaded big truck.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you.
Verification.
So yeah, the sawmills and the lumber industry is still alive and well in Brattleboro.
comment, about rolling back to Ira Allen. What possible motive would he have for not bringing his story up?
Yeah,
Let's take a look at that, and I think it's true, because why would they? Because I think those loyalties preceded the conflict, and maybe they endured.
yeah, and Captain Nutley, who was the owner of the house, I mean, he was a real person. He could have, in 1798, said, "Oh, that's not what happened." So,
Well, and to this day, Vermont enjoys a particular quality of independence. I keep thinking about the Bernie Sanders,
yeah,
but
that's
I
what it
mean,
is then.
they.
Nikki Haley won it last night
Yeah,
in the
they-
Republican
but
primary.
See, they chart their own course. They chart their own course, these guys.
Yeah.
Okay.
Are we out of questions?
Well, there it is.
I think so.
There are no more questions in the chat that I can see.
Okay.
Thank you.
Oh.
Thank you so much.